When a prominent family returns to their London home to find objects subtly rearranged but nothing stolen, no one expects it will lead to international espionage. Welcome to Café Stories. I am your host, Alfie. Today, we're stepping into the foggy streets of Victorian London with Sherlock Holmes in The Enigma of the Empty House. I truly treasure this community we've built together. So drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from today. Grab a coffee, stay curious, and let's get started. Chapter 1. The Curious Complaint. It was one of those dreary February afternoons when London seems encased in a perpetual twilight. The fog had descended early that morning, wrapping the city in its damp embrace, and even now at 3:30, it pressed against our windows like some sentient thing seeking entrance. The gaslight in our sitting room at Baker Street cast a yellowed glow that did little to dispel the gloom, serving instead to throw Sherlock Holmes's angular profile into sharp relief as he bent over his chemical apparatus. For the past 3 hours, he had been engaged in a delicate experiment involving the detection of specific formulations in various writing inks, maintaining that perfect concentration which I had so often observed in him when occupied with a scientific problem. Several small bottles were arranged before him, each containing a different solution, and he was transferring drops from one to another with the precision of a skilled apothecary. "Watson," he remarked without looking up, "I believe I am on the verge of creating a reagent that will distinguish between the standard government ink used in Whitehall and the remarkably similar formula employed by that forger in the Blackwood case last autumn." "Indeed," I replied, looking up from my medical journal. "That would certainly have expedited matters in that investigation." "Precisely," said Holmes. "It is always advantageous to perfect one's methods in anticipation of future requirements. The criminal classes evolve their techniques. We must do likewise." He had just added a pale blue solution to a test tube containing a black liquid when our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, knocked and entered. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "A Mr. Edward Thornhill. He seems most distressed despite his composed manner." Holmes glanced at his experiment with evident reluctance, then sighed. "Very well, Mrs. Hudson. Please show him up." As our landlady departed, Holmes carefully set aside his chemicals. "It is perhaps fortuitous timing, Watson. I had reached a natural pause in my work, and the name Thornhill suggests our visitor may present something of interest." "You know him?" I inquired. "I know of him," Holmes corrected. "Edward Thornhill is one of London's pre-eminent shipping magnates. His company has expanded considerably in recent years, particularly in securing government contracts. The Times business pages have mentioned him several times this past month." Before I could respond, we heard footsteps on the stairs and Mrs. Hudson showed in our visitor. Mr. Edward Thornhill was a tall, solidly built man of perhaps 50 years, with the weathered complexion of one who had spent much of his life near the sea. His clothes were of excellent quality but conservative in style, and his salt and pepper hair was immaculately groomed. Despite these outward signs of prosperity and composure, I noted immediately the strain evident in the tightness around his eyes and the way his gloved hand gripped the handle of his walking stick. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, his voice deep and measured. "I am," replied my friend, motioning our visitor to the chair opposite. "This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, who has assisted me in many of my cases and whose discretion is absolute. Please, make yourself comfortable and tell us what brings you here on such an inclement afternoon." Thornhill settled himself into the chair, placing his hat and gloves on the small table beside him with deliberate care. "Mr. Holmes, I find myself in the unusual position of seeking assistance for a matter the police have dismissed as trivial, yet which has caused considerable distress to my family, particularly my wife." "Pray continue," said Holmes, leaning back and steepling his fingers beneath his chin, his keen grey eyes fixed upon our visitor. My family and I returned 3 days ago from a winter holiday in Switzerland. We had been away for just over a month, leaving our London residence under the care of our butler and housekeeper, the Winters, who have been in our service for over 15 years. Upon our return, everything appeared to be in perfect order. No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, nothing obviously disturbed. Thornhill paused, his brow furrowing. And yet, Mr. Holmes, something was wrong. In what way? Holmes asked quietly. It is difficult to articulate precisely, Thornhill admitted. At first, it was merely a sense, an impression that things were not quite as we had left them. My wife, Eleanor, noticed it first. She said the house felt different. I attributed it to our recent absence until she began to point out specific details. A chair in the drawing room, positioned 2 inches from where it normally stands, books on shelves rearranged subtly, ornaments turned at slightly different angles. Were any valuable items missing? That's just it, replied Thornhill. Nothing at all was taken, not the silver, not my wife's jewellery, not even the small collection of gold sovereigns I keep in my desk drawer. Yet the more we looked, the more we noticed these minute discrepancies throughout the house, particularly in my study where I conduct my business affairs. And you consulted the police? I inquired. Thornhill's expression hardened momentarily. I did, Doctor. Inspector Lestrade himself came to call. He was polite but dismissive. Suggested it was merely the servants cleaning more thoroughly in our absence, or perhaps my wife's memory playing tricks after our time away. But Eleanor has an exceptional eye for detail, and the Winters swear they moved nothing beyond their normal cleaning routine. Holmes rose from his chair and paced slowly to the window, where he stood for a moment looking out at the fog-shrouded street. Mr. Thornhill, he said without turning, in your professional capacity, have you recently been involved in any particularly sensitive negotiations? Any contracts that might attract unwanted attention from competitors? Our visitor's sharp intake of breath was audible. As a matter of fact, yes. My company is currently finalizing arrangements with the Admiralty for the transport of certain materials of a confidential nature. The terms are quite favorable, uniquely so, I might add. Holmes turned back to the room, his expression animated with interest. Then I believe your case merits investigation, Mr. Thornhill. I shall call upon you tomorrow morning to examine your residence. The address is Number 17, Chester Square, Belgravia, replied Thornhill, rising to his feet with evident relief. You will come then? I cannot express my gratitude adequately, Mr. Holmes. Reserve your gratitude until I have achieved results, Holmes answered, though I could see from the gleam in his eye that the problem had captured his imagination. One final question before you depart. Have there been any unusual visitors to your household in the weeks before your holiday? Any new staff members or workmen engaged for repairs or improvements? Thornhill considered this for a moment. No workmen recently, though the house next to ours has been undergoing extensive renovations. As for staff, our maid Agnes left rather suddenly about 2 months ago, but she had been with us for nearly 3 years. I see, said Holmes. Until tomorrow then, Mr. Thornhill. After our visitor had departed, Holmes returned to the window, gazing out into the gathering darkness with that distant expression I knew so well. The chemical experiment lay forgotten on the table. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked, breaking the silence. His lips curled into a faint smile. "It presents some interesting features, Watson. A house disturbed yet not robbed. Objects moved with such subtlety that only the most observant would notice, and a connection to sensitive government contracts. Yes, there is much to recommend this case. The fog pressed closer against our windows as Holmes reached for his violin, and soon the melancholy strains of Bach filled our sitting room, accompanying my friend's deep contemplation of the puzzle that had been laid before us. Chapter 2. A House Disturbed. The following morning dawned bright and clear, a welcome change from the previous day's oppressive fog. Holmes had sent a telegram to Mr. Thornhill informing him of our intended visit, and by 9:30 we found ourselves in a hansom cab rattling through the London streets toward Belgravia. My friend had been unusually silent during our journey, his keen eyes fixed on the passing scenery, while his long fingers drummed thoughtfully against his knee. I knew from long experience that this was his way when a problem engaged his full attention, and I did not interrupt his meditations until our cab drew up before an imposing townhouse in Chester Square. "You anticipate finding something of significance, Holmes?" I ventured as we alighted. He turned to me with that quick, sharp glance that indicated his mind had momentarily surfaced from its depths. "Always, Watson. The most revealing clues are often those which others have deemed too insignificant to notice. In this case, the very subtlety of the intrusion suggests a purpose beyond common burglary." The door was opened before we could knock by a dignified butler, whose impeccable appearance was somewhat belied by the anxious expression in his eyes. "Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson," he announced, ushering us into a spacious entrance hall adorned with tasteful artwork and an impressive oak staircase. "Mr. Thornhill is expecting you, gentlemen. Please follow me." "You are Winters, I presume?" Holmes inquired as we followed the butler across the polished floor. The man turned with a look of mild surprise. "Yes, sir. James Winters." "And you and your wife were the only staff in residence during the family's absence?" "That is correct, sir. My wife Martha and I have managed the household for many years." Holmes nodded, his gaze already sweeping over the surroundings with that peculiar intensity I had so often observed. Even as we walked, I could see him noting details, the wear patterns on the carpet runner, the alignment of picture frames, the position of a hall table that showed evidence of having been recently moved by a fraction of an inch. We were shown into a handsome drawing-room where Edward Thornhill stood before the fireplace. Beside him sat a woman whom I took to be Mrs. Eleanor Thornhill, a handsome, well-preserved lady of perhaps 45 years, whose composed features nevertheless betrayed an underlying tension. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." Thornhill greeted us with evident relief. "May I present my wife Eleanor and my daughter Lillian?" I had not immediately noticed the young woman seated by the window, a thoughtful-looking girl of perhaps 20, with her mother's fine features and her father's direct gaze. "My son Frederick is away at Oxford," Thornhill continued, "and knows nothing of this business. We thought it best not to alarm him unnecessarily." "A sensible precaution," Holmes agreed. "Now, Mrs. Thornhill, I understand you were the first to notice the disturbances in your home." Eleanor Thornhill's hands tightened slightly in her lap. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. The moment we crossed the threshold upon our return, I sensed something was amiss. The house appeared exactly as we had left it, and yet it wasn't." She gave a small, self-conscious laugh. "I realize how irrational that must sound." "Not at all," Holmes replied with unexpected gentleness. "The human mind is remarkably attuned to patterns and their disruption, even when we cannot immediately articulate what has changed. Pray, tell me which discrepancies you first observed." "The drawing-room was where I noticed it most clearly," she said, gesturing around us. "That chair by the escritoire. It had been moved perhaps 2 inches from its customary position. The figurines on the mantelpiece had been rearranged slightly. In my bedroom, my perfume bottles had been repositioned, and several books in the library had been shelved in a different order than our usual practice." I was sceptical at first, Thornhill admitted, but when I entered my study, I too felt the disturbance. My desk chair was at a different angle. The writing implements had been rearranged, though all were present. Even the curtains hung at a slightly different gather than is my habit. Holmes listened intently, his expression betraying nothing. "And you are both certain these changes could not have been made by your household staff during routine cleaning?" "Absolutely certain," Mrs. Thornhill replied firmly. "The Winters know our preferences exactly. Besides, many of these items I had personally arranged just before our departure. I questioned them most carefully," added Thornhill. "They are as disturbed by these occurrences as we are." "I should like to examine the house systematically," Holmes said, rising from his chair. "Perhaps beginning with your study, Mr. Thornhill, and then proceeding to the other rooms where these disturbances were most evident." We were led to a handsome study at the rear of the house, a well-proportioned room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large mahogany desk positioned to take advantage of the light from two tall windows overlooking a small garden. The furnishings were of excellent quality, understated yet speaking of considerable wealth. Holmes began his examination immediately, moving with methodical precision. I had witnessed this process many times before. The careful scrutiny of seemingly ordinary objects, the minute attention to details others might overlook, the occasional muted exclamation when something caught his particular notice. He dropped to his knees to examine the carpet, used his pocket lens to study the desk's surface, and measured the distance between furniture pieces with a small tape measure he produced from his pocket. "Mr. Thornhill," he said after some time, "you mentioned that you keep a collection of gold sovereigns in your desk. Would you be so good as to check if they remain undisturbed?" Thornhill moved to his desk, unlocked a drawer with a key from his waistcoat pocket, and withdrew a small leather pouch. "All present, Mr. Holmes. 20 sovereigns, exactly as I left them." Holmes nodded, continuing his examination of the room's perimeter. He paused at a section of wood panelling, running his fingertips along a seam, then moved to inspect the window frames and sills with particular attention. "Mrs. Thornhill," he called suddenly, "you mentioned personal items in your bedroom that had been disturbed. Have you replaced or rearranged them since your return?" "Some of them," she admitted. "I felt uncomfortable using things that someone else had handled. My hairbrushes, for instance, I replaced them entirely." "A natural reaction," Holmes remarked, "though perhaps unfortunate from an investigative perspective." "And you, Miss Thornhill," he turned to the daughter, "did you notice anything amiss in your quarters?" Lillian Thornhill, who had been watching Holmes's examination with evident fascination, straightened slightly. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, my journal had been moved from the drawer where I keep it to my bedside table, and my collection of pressed flowers had been rearranged in its album." "Most interesting," murmured Holmes. "Items of a personal rather than valuable nature." For nearly 2 hours, Holmes continued his meticulous inspection of the house, examining each room where disturbances had been noted. In the master bedroom, he spent considerable time studying the dressing table and wardrobe. In the library, he checked the position of multiple volumes, occasionally removing one to examine its pages or the space it had occupied. Throughout this process, I observed something curious in his manner, a growing intensity, a heightened alertness that suggested he was finding more than might be apparent to the rest of us. I had seen this manner before, when seemingly disconnected details were beginning to form a pattern in his remarkable mind. Finally, we returned to the study, where Holmes requested that the family give us a few moments of privacy. When they had withdrawn, Holmes turned to me, his eyes bright with that familiar spark of discovery. "What do you make of it, Watson?" he asked, gesturing around the room. "It seems extraordinary that someone would break into a house merely to rearrange the furnishings," I replied. "Perhaps a servant with a grudge, seeking to cause distress without risking more serious charges." Holmes shook his head. "Observe these marks on the carpet, Watson, the indentations here beside the desk and the subtle wear pattern by the bookcase. They indicate someone standing in these precise spots for extended periods, yet they do not match the positions where one would naturally stand when using these furnishings for their intended purpose." Before I could question him further, Holmes dropped to his knees beside the desk, using his lens to examine something caught in the mechanism of a drawer. With delicate precision, he extracted what appeared to be a single thread, holding it up to the light between his finger and thumb. "A thread, Holmes?" I asked. "Surely that could belong to any member of the household." "Perhaps," he replied, carefully securing the thread in a small envelope. "But the weave and dye are distinctive, not English manufacture if I'm not mistaken, and observe its position caught precisely in the drawer containing Thornhill's business correspondence." His expression grew serious. "This case, Watson, is far more significant than mere household mischief. I believe the Thornhill residence has had a visitor, or perhaps a resident, with a very specific purpose in mind." Chapter 3. The Hidden Observer. "I think, Watson," said Holmes as he carefully pocketed the envelope containing the mysterious thread, "that we should intensify our examination of this study. If my suspicions are correct, it is here that we shall find the key to this peculiar intrusion." We had been reunited with the Thornhill family, who watched with evident anxiety as Holmes resumed his meticulous inspection of the room. This time his attention focused primarily on the wood-panelled walls, which were of a rich mahogany that complemented the substantial desk and furnishings. "Mr. Thornhill?" Holmes inquired, tapping lightly on various sections of the panelling. "Are you in the habit of discussing business matters in this room?" "Certainly," replied our client. "I frequently hold meetings here with my shipping partners and occasionally with government officials regarding our contracts. The room is well insulated from the rest of the house, which makes it ideal for confidential discussions." "And these discussions, would you characterize them as sensitive in nature?" Thornhill exchanged a glance with his wife before answering. "Some of them, yes. Particularly those pertaining to our recent negotiations with the Admiralty. The terms of such arrangements are necessarily discreet." Holmes nodded, continuing his examination of the panelling. He moved methodically around the perimeter of the room, occasionally pausing to press his ear against the wall or to examine a particular section with his lens. His manner was so focused that none dared interrupt him, though I noted Miss Lillian Thornhill watching him with undisguised fascination. "The craftsmanship is remarkable," Holmes commented, seemingly to himself. "One might almost overlook it entirely." Suddenly he stopped, his attention arrested by a section of panelling adjacent to where Mr. Thornhill's desk was positioned. His long, nimble fingers traced the decorative moulding with exquisite care. "Watson," he called softly, "your medical bag, if you please." I handed him my bag, from which he extracted a small scalpel. With surgical precision, Holmes inserted the fine blade into an almost imperceptible seam in the woodwork. There was a faint click, and to the astonishment of all present, a small section of the panel, no larger than a playing card, shifted slightly. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Thornhill, moving closer. "I had no idea there was any such mechanism in the wall." With delicate movements, Holmes extracted from the concealed recess what appeared to be a small metallic device, roughly the size of a snuff-box. It was an intricate mechanism of brass and steel, with a thin membrane stretched across one surface and a complex arrangement of small gears visible through an opening on one side. Attached to it was a coil of fine wire that disappeared into the wall cavity. "What in God's name is that?" asked Thornhill, his face paling. "This, Mr. Thornhill," replied Holmes, holding the device carefully to the light, is a most sophisticated listening mechanism, what some in certain government circles might call a sound interceptor. It is of continental manufacture, if I'm not mistaken, Czech, or possibly German in origin. Mrs. Thornhill gave a small gasp. You mean someone has been listening to us? Precisely, said Holmes. This device has been expertly positioned to capture conversations taking place at your desk, Mr. Thornhill. The sound vibrations cause this membrane to oscillate, which in turn activates these remarkably delicate mechanisms. It is an ingenious design, far more advanced than similar devices I have encountered previously. I stared at the contraption with astonishment. But surely such a device must connect to something, some means of transmitting or recording what it captures. An astute observation, Watson, Holmes replied, examining the wire. This connection suggests that our eavesdropper required a physical presence to collect the intelligence gathered. The wire leads somewhere, and I intend to discover its terminus. With careful movements, Holmes extracted more of the wire from the wall cavity, finding that it ran upward within the wall. It would be inadvisable to pull it further without knowing its path, he observed. We might damage evidence in the process. Thornhill's face had turned from pale to flushed with anger. This is outrageous. Who would dare install such a device in my home, and what could they hope to gain? As to the latter question, Holmes replied calmly, I believe the answer lies in your business affairs, particularly your negotiations with the Admiralty. Information regarding shipping routes, cargo manifests, and schedules for vessels carrying sensitive materials would be of considerable value to certain parties. He carefully placed the listening device on the desk, ensuring the wire remained intact. Now, Mr. Thornhill, I must ask you some rather specific questions about recent visitors to your household. Mrs. Thornhill mentioned that your maid Agnes departed suddenly before your holiday. Could you elaborate on the circumstances? Eleanor Thornhill answered, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Agnes Wilson had been with us for nearly 3 years, a quiet girl, efficient, and seemingly loyal. About 2 months before our departure for Switzerland, she announced she had received word that her mother was gravely ill in Manchester and needed to return home immediately. We provided her with her wages and a small additional sum to assist with her journey. We had no reason to doubt her story. Did she handle any correspondence or have access to Mr. Thornhill's papers? Holmes inquired. No, Thornhill replied firmly. The staff is strictly forbidden from disturbing anything in my study. Only my wife and I possess keys to this room. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. And what of business associates or other visitors who might have had occasion to be in this room in recent months? There have been several, admitted Thornhill, beginning to count on his fingers. Admiral Harrington from the Admiralty, my solicitor, Mr. Graves, Victor Rawlins, who represents a consortium interested in investing in our Baltic routes, and Sebastian Moran, a competitor who has been making overtures about a potential merger of certain operations. At the mention of Moran's name, I noticed a flicker of intensity cross Holmes's features, so brief that I doubted anyone else had perceived it. Having been privy to many of his cases, I knew the name had significant associations in Holmes's mental catalogue. This Sebastian Moran, Holmes said casually, though I detected the undercurrent of heightened interest in his tone. Would you describe him as particularly knowledgeable about your business operations? Disturbingly so, admitted Thornhill. His company has often seemed one step ahead of our own initiatives. I had attributed it to good intelligence work through normal channels, but now— He gestured helplessly at the listening device. Indeed, murmured Holmes. Watson, I believe you would be of great assistance in interviewing the household staff. There may be observations, seemingly trivial details about visitors or unusual occurrences that could prove illuminating. Meanwhile, I shall pursue certain technical inquiries regarding this device. He turned to Thornhill. With your permission, I would like to examine the servants' quarters and any other areas of the house where someone might have gained access. I am particularly interested in the adjacent property you mentioned is under renovation." As the Thornhills led Holmes to inspect the rest of the house, I remained behind to begin the interviews, starting with the butler, James Winters. The man was clearly disturbed by the discovery, his usual dignity somewhat diminished by evident anxiety. "Mr. Winters," I began, "in the time prior to the family's departure, did you notice any unusual callers or occurrences, workmen, deliveries, or unexpected visitors?" "Nothing out of the ordinary, sir," he replied, though I noticed a slight hesitation in his manner. "There were the usual household deliveries, of course, and Mr. Thornhill's business associates, as he mentioned." "And what of Agnes Wilson's departure? Did anything strike you as unusual about it?" A shadow seemed to cross the butler's features. "Only that it was rather sudden, sir, and now that I think on it, she received several letters in the weeks before she left, more correspondence than had been her custom previously." I made careful note of this detail, knowing that Holmes would find it significant. As I continued my interview, I could not help glancing at the strange device on the desk, a silent witness to countless private conversations, placed with such cunning that even the most observant members of the household had failed to detect its presence for what must have been months. What secrets had it captured, and to what purpose would they be employed? I felt a growing disquiet as I contemplated the implications of such an invasion. Holmes had been right. We were dealing with something far more sinister than mere household mischief. Someone had been watching, listening, and waiting in the shadows of this seemingly secure home, and the thread of their intrusion was only beginning to unravel. Chapter 4. Threads and Connections. I spent the remainder of the morning and a good portion of the afternoon interviewing the Thornhill household staff. James Winters, the butler, had been joined by his wife Martha, the housekeeper, a capable-looking woman, whose obvious distress at the situation was tempered by a fierce loyalty to her employers. In addition, I spoke with the cook, Mrs. Baxter, a portly, red-faced woman whose domain was the kitchen, and two younger maids who had been hired after Agnes Wilson's departure. Throughout these conversations, I maintained the methodical approach Holmes had taught me to employ, establishing timelines, noting discrepancies, and paying particular attention to any mention of unusual occurrences in the weeks prior to the family's departure for Switzerland. It was during my second interview with Winters that something caught my attention. "You mentioned earlier that there were no unusual visitors," I said, consulting my notes. "Yet Mrs. Winters recalls a man delivering a package specifically to Mr. Thornhill's study approximately 3 weeks before the family's departure, a delivery you personally received." A slight flush appeared on the butler's pale cheeks. "Ah, yes, I had quite forgotten. There was indeed such a delivery, a parcel containing some specialized maps Mr. Thornhill had ordered. The courier required that it be placed directly in the study." "And you admitted this person to the study?" I asked, keeping my tone conversational. Yes, Mr. Thornhill was out at the time, and the man was most insistent that the materials were valuable and must be secured properly." "I accompanied him, of course," Winters added hastily. "He placed the parcel on the desk and departed immediately." "Can you describe this courier?" Winters frowned in concentration. A nondescript fellow, medium height, well dressed for his position. He wore spectacles and had a short beard. Foreign accent, German, perhaps, or possibly Swiss. I made careful note of this description, certain that Holmes would find it significant. There were other small inconsistencies in the staff's accounts, times when Agnes had been observed entering rooms where she had no duties, occasions when lights had been seen in unused portions of the house late at night, attributed to the master checking the property, and reports from the younger maids of items seemingly moved from their proper places, only to be found again in their original positions. As I concluded the final interview, the door opened to admit Holmes, whose energetic stride and bright expression told me immediately that his investigations had yielded results. "Ah, Watson, I trust your interviews have been productive?" he inquired, rubbing his hands together with evident satisfaction. "I believe so," I replied, gathering my notes. "There are several points of interest, particularly regarding a courier who delivered a package to Mr. Thornhill's study." "Excellent. We shall compare our findings momentarily, but first I must speak with our client." The Thornhills were assembled in the drawing-room, the strain of the day evident on their faces. Holmes entered with that air of controlled excitement I knew so well, addressing them with a clipped precision that indicated his mind was working at full capacity. "Mr. Thornhill, I require some specific information about your shipping business," he announced without preamble, "particularly regarding your negotiations with the Admiralty." Thornhill glanced at his wife and daughter. "Perhaps we should speak privately, Mr. Holmes?" "By all means. But first, a quick question for Miss Thornhill." Holmes turned to the young woman, who sat straight-backed beside her mother. "The photographs displayed in the hallway, those from the Christmas gathering last year, would you permit me to examine them?" Lillian looked momentarily surprised, but nodded. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. They are family treasures, taken when Frederick was last home from university." Holmes followed her to the hallway, where several handsomely framed photographs were displayed. He spent several minutes studying them intently, occasionally using his pocket lens to examine particular details. "Most illuminating," he murmured, before straightening and giving the young woman a brief smile. "Thank you, Miss Thornhill. Now, if you'll excuse us, I must speak with your father." Once we were sequestered in the study with Mr. Thornhill, Holmes wasted no time in coming to the point. "Your current negotiations with the Admiralty, they concern the transport of naval supplies to strategic bases in the Mediterranean, do they not?" Thornhill's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That is correct, Mr. Holmes, but how could you possibly know the specifics? A reasonable inference based on current geopolitical concerns and the operational patterns of the Royal Navy," Holmes replied dismissively. "More to the point, your company has been selected over your competitors due to your innovative approach to secure transport and your exemplary record of reliability." "Yes," Thornhill confirmed, looking increasingly bewildered. "We have developed new methods for securing sensitive cargo and maintaining strict schedules. The contract would be the largest we have ever undertaken." Holmes nodded briskly. "And among your competitors for this contract was the firm headed by Sebastian Moran?" "Indeed. His company, Anglo-Oriental Shipping, has been our chief rival for years. They were considered the frontrunners for this contract until our proposal was submitted." Thornhill's expression darkened. "Are you suggesting Moran is behind this intrusion, Mr. Holmes?" "I am suggesting nothing at present," replied Holmes cautiously. "Merely establishing connections. Tell me, what do you know of Sebastian Moran personally?" Thornhill considered the question before answering. "He's a relative newcomer to the shipping industry, perhaps 5 years at most. He acquired Anglo-Oriental when it was floundering and transformed it into a formidable operation with remarkable speed. He's well connected, moves in influential circles, and has a reputation for ruthless efficiency. We've met at industry functions and once for direct discussions about potentially sharing certain routes to India." "And his background before entering the shipping business?" "Military, I believe. He served as an officer in India, though I'm uncertain of the details. He speaks little of his past." Holmes exchanged a significant glance with me before continuing. "Thank you, Mr. Thornhill. Now Watson and I must confer briefly. We shall rejoin you shortly." Once we were alone, I shared the information gleaned from my interviews, paying particular attention to the mysterious courier and the discrepancies in the butler's account. Holmes listened intently, occasionally making notes in his small, leather-bound notebook. "Most interesting, Watson," he said when I had finished. "These threads begin to weave a rather disturbing pattern. During your interviews, I conducted a thorough examination of the remaining rooms and made some inquiries by telegram regarding our listening device. The technology is indeed of German manufacture, but it has been modified by someone with considerable expertise." He pulled from his pocket several folded papers. "I also received responses to my morning telegrams regarding Sebastian Moran. The information confirms my suspicions about his identity." He tapped the papers thoughtfully against his palm. "But that is a matter for later consideration." Holmes moved to the study window, gazing out at the adjoining property where renovation work was underway. "Watson, there is something else of significance. When examining Miss Thornhill's photographs from the Christmas gathering, I observed the study in the background of several images. The dimensions visible in those photographs, when compared to the actual room, suggest a discrepancy of approximately 16 inches in the wall adjoining the next property." "A hidden space?" I asked, immediately grasping his implication. "Precisely. This house dates from the Tudor period, though it has been extensively modernized. Such properties often contained what were known as priest holes, concealed chambers where Catholic clergy could hide during periods of persecution." He turned back to me, his expression grave. "But what interests me most at present is this. The listening device we discovered is only part of a larger operation. The wire leads somewhere, and I believe a more thorough examination is warranted, one best conducted when the household is not alert to our every movement." "You propose returning later?" I inquired. "Tonight, Watson," Holmes replied, his eyes glinting with anticipation. "Our quarry has been extraordinarily careful, but even the most meticulous adversary leaves traces, and I intend to follow those traces to their source." As we rejoined the Thornhill family to share some carefully curated portions of our discoveries, I could not help but feel a growing sense of unease. Whatever purpose had driven someone to install such an elaborate surveillance system in this house, it spoke of resources, determination, and most disturbingly, patience. Holmes had once observed that the most dangerous criminals were those who could plan methodically and wait for precisely the right moment to act. Someone had been watching and listening to the Thornhills for months, and I suspected we had only begun to uncover the true extent of their invisible presence. Chapter 5. The Priest Hole. The evening was unusually dark, with heavy clouds obscuring both moon and stars as Holmes and I made our way back to the Thornhill residence shortly after 11 o'clock. Earlier, we had taken our leave with assurances that progress was being made, recommending that the family maintain their normal routines while we pursued our inquiries. Holmes had been explicit in his instructions that nothing should be touched in the study, and that the household should retire at their usual hour. "It is essential, Watson," Holmes had murmured as we departed, "that we create no expectations of our return tonight. If there is indeed someone monitoring the house, as I strongly suspect, we must not alert them to our intentions." And so we found ourselves approaching Chester Square from the rear, using the garden mews that ran behind the row of elegant houses. Holmes had exchanged his usual attire for darker garments, and I had done likewise at his suggestion. We carried dark lanterns carefully shuttered, and Holmes had brought along a small leather case containing various implements whose purpose I could only guess at. "The servants' entrance," Holmes whispered, as we approached the garden wall of the Thornhill property. "Winters has left it unlocked as I requested. though he believes it is to allow an associate of mine to examine the listening device in the early morning. We slipped through the garden with the stealth of shadows, and Holmes deftly opened the servant's door. Once inside, we paused in the dimly lit kitchen, waiting for our eyes to adjust to the gloom. The house was silent, save for the measured ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall beyond. The family and servants should all be abed by now, Holmes whispered. We must proceed with utmost caution to the study. I have particular reason to believe that someone may be monitoring the house even as we speak. We moved silently through the household corridors, our lanterns providing just enough light to prevent collision with furniture. Upon reaching the study, Holmes carefully unlocked the door using a key Mr. Thornhill had provided him earlier that day. Once inside with the door closed behind us, Holmes allowed his lantern to cast a slightly broader beam, illuminating the familiar contours of the room. The listening device still lay upon the desk where we had left it, its wire trailing toward the wall. "Now, Watson," Holmes said in a low voice, "we must examine the panelling with the greatest care. The dimensional discrepancy I noted suggests that the wall concealing the priest hole is most likely this one shared with the adjacent property." For nearly 20 minutes, Holmes conducted a painstaking examination of the wood panelling on the eastern wall of the study. His long, sensitive fingers probed every join, moulding, and decorative carving with exquisite care. I watched in fascination as he worked methodically from one end to the other, occasionally consulting a small notebook in which he had sketched measurements. "Ah," he exclaimed softly. "Observe here, Watson, this section of moulding is subtly different from its neighbours. The oak is of identical appearance, but fractionally newer, perhaps replaced within the last century. And note the wear on this decorative rosette." He pressed the wooden ornament firmly, then simultaneously twisted it a quarter-turn clockwise. There was a soft click, and to my astonishment, a section of the panelling, approximately 3 feet wide and 7 feet high, shifted inward by perhaps an inch. "A spring mechanism," Holmes explained, carefully pulling the panel further open to reveal a dark space beyond. Ingenious in its simplicity and virtually undetectable unless one knows precisely what to seek. The original mechanism likely dates from the Tudor period, though I suspect it has been maintained and perhaps modified over the centuries. He directed his lantern into the opening, revealing a narrow chamber scarcely 4 feet in width, but extending the full height of the room. What caught my attention immediately, however, was the evidence of recent occupation. A small pallet lay on the floor, neatly arranged with blankets. Beside it stood a modest wooden crate, serving as a table, upon which lay several items: the remains of food wrapped in paper, a water flask, and most significantly, what appeared to be technical equipment connected to the wire from the listening device. "Good heavens, Holmes," I whispered. "Someone has been living in here." "Not merely living, Watson," Holmes replied, carefully stepping into the space. "Observing, listening, and recording. This is what our American friends might call a stakeout, a concealed position from which to conduct surveillance." The chamber was surprisingly well appointed for its purpose. Besides the sleeping pallet, it contained a small portable chemical toilet discreetly positioned in one corner, a shelf with various supplies, and most importantly, a sophisticated apparatus connected to the listening device we had discovered earlier. "This equipment," Holmes explained, examining it closely without touching, "is designed to record vibrations onto wax cylinders similar to a phonograph, but far more sensitive. Our intruder could monitor conversations in the study and preserve them for later review or transcription." "But how could anyone remain here undetected for extended periods?" I asked, still struggling to comprehend the audacity of such an arrangement. Holmes indicated a narrow vertical shaft at the rear of the chamber. "Ventilation, Watson. These priest holes were designed to sustain occupants for days if necessary. and observe these markings on the rear wall, I believe there is access to the adjacent property, providing our intruder with a means of entrance and exit independent of the Thornhill household. He ran his fingers along the wall, pausing at certain points to apply pressure. Yes, just as I suspected, this section moves, though the mechanism appears to be operated from the other side. As Holmes continued his examination, I inspected the pallet and supplies with my medical eye. Whoever stayed here was methodical and neat, I observed. The bedding is precisely arranged, the food wrappers carefully contained. There's something almost military in the orderliness. "A keen observation, Watson," Holmes replied, now examining a small notebook he had discovered beneath the recording equipment. "Our intruder is indeed a man of military background and exacting habits." He carefully turned the pages of the notebook, which contained what appeared to be notes in a tight, precise hand, occasionally interspersed with what I recognized as technical diagrams. "The writing is in cipher," Holmes murmured, though not an unfamiliar one. "I shall need proper light to decipher it fully, but I can already make out certain keywords: shipment, schedule, and Mediterranean route among them." He placed the notebook in his pocket and continued his examination of the chamber. "Whoever has been occupying this space appears to have departed in some haste within the past 24 hours. Note the food remains, bread crust still firm, apple core only slightly browned. He left shortly after the family's return, I would wager, but intended to return. The equipment remains in place, and these supplies would sustain someone for several more days." As Holmes spoke, a faint sound from elsewhere in the house caught our attention. A soft creak, such as might be made by a cautious footstep on the stairs. We instantly extinguished our lanterns, plunging the hidden chamber into darkness. "Someone is moving in the house," Holmes whispered, his mouth close to my ear. "Whether family member or intruder, we cannot risk discovery at this juncture. Remain absolutely still." We stood frozen in the darkness of the priest hole, scarcely daring to breathe. The seconds stretched interminably as we listened for further sounds. After what seemed an eternity, we heard it again. Another creak, this time closer, followed by the soft but unmistakable sound of the study door being carefully opened. Holmes gripped my arm in warning, pressing us both deeper into the shadows of the priest hole. Through the narrow opening we had left in the panel, a faint light now filtered into the study. Not the yellow glow of a gas lamp or candle, but the focused beam of a dark lantern similar to our own. Someone had entered the Thornhill study, moving with the deliberate stealth that spoke not of a household member, but of an intruder. From our concealed position, we could see little more than a shadowy figure moving toward the desk where the listening device still lay. Holmes's grip on my arm tightened fractionally, a silent communication that I understood perfectly. We had stumbled upon a critical moment in our investigation, and our next actions would require the utmost caution. The hunter and the hunted had converged in the darkness, though it remained unclear which role we would ultimately play in the drama unfolding before us. Chapter 6. The Night Visitor. We remained motionless in the darkness of the priest hole, scarcely daring to breathe as the intruder moved about the study. Through the narrow gap in the panel, I could discern only a silhouette, a man of medium height, wearing dark clothing, his features impossible to distinguish in the carefully controlled beam of his dark lantern. Holmes's hand still gripped my arm, a silent command for absolute stillness. Years of friendship had taught me to read his slightest gesture. This was not the moment for confrontation, but for observation. The unknown figure moved with a practiced stealth that spoke of professional training, his footfalls nearly silent on the carpet as he approached the desk. I felt a momentary pang of alarm as he reached for the listening device we had discovered earlier. With methodical precision, he disconnected it from its wire and replaced it with a similar mechanism produced from his pocket. The exchange was executed with such deftness that had we not been watching specifically for such activity, it would have been imperceptible. The intruder then moved to the section of panelling where the original device had been hidden. Using what appeared to be a specialized tool, he opened the concealed compartment and adjusted something within, presumably securing the new device in place of the one Holmes had discovered. His movements suggested intimate familiarity with both the mechanism and the room's layout. What followed startled me despite my determined silence. Instead of departing as I had expected, the man turned toward the very section of wall concealing our presence. My muscles tensed involuntarily, but Holmes's warning pressure on my arm increased. The intruder approached the priest hole, and for a terrible moment I was certain we had been detected. Then, with the subtle movement that mirrored Holmes's earlier actions, he pressed and twisted the decorative rosette. The panel we had left slightly ajar now opened fully, and the man stepped directly into the priest hole, scarcely an arm's length from where we stood, pressed against the wall in the deepest shadow. Had he turned his lantern in our direction, discovery would have been inevitable. Instead, he moved confidently to the recording equipment, his back to us, as he removed the wax cylinder and replaced it with a fresh one from his pocket. His actions were swift and practiced, suggesting he had performed this exchange many times before. Only now, with the man so close, could I detect the faint scent of a distinctive tobacco, not the common Virginia blend favoured by most Englishmen, but something more exotic, with notes of Turkish leaf. Holmes, I knew, would be cataloguing this and every other detail for later reference. The intruder completed his task, made a brief notation in a small pocketbook, then moved toward the rear wall of the priest hole. Confirming Holmes's earlier suspicion, he manipulated a section of the panelling which swung inward to reveal a narrow passage. Without a backward glance, he stepped through this opening and closed it behind him, leaving us once again alone in the darkness. For nearly a full minute, we remained motionless. Then Holmes relaxed his grip on my arm and allowed his shuttered lantern to emit the faintest glimmer of light. "Not yet, Watson," he whispered, his lips nearly touching my ear. "He may return if he has forgotten anything. We must give him time to clear the premises." We waited in silence for what seemed an interminable period, but was likely no more than 10 minutes. Finally, Holmes judged it safe to open his lantern further, casting its beam around the priest hole. "A most illuminating encounter," he murmured, examining the fresh recording equipment. "Our visitor has confirmed several of my hypotheses and provided valuable new information." "Should we not pursue him?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "He cannot have gone far." "To what end, Watson?" "Through an unfamiliar passage, in the dark, against an adversary who knows the terrain intimately." "No, that would be precipitous. We have gained far more by observation than we would by a premature confrontation." Holmes carefully examined the rear wall where the man had disappeared. "This passage almost certainly leads to the adjacent property under renovation, a most convenient arrangement for our spy." Holmes turned his attention to the recording apparatus, studying it without disturbing its position. "German craftsmanship of the highest quality. Such equipment is not readily available to the public. It suggests connections to official or at least semi-official agencies." "Could he be a foreign agent?" I ventured. "Perhaps," Holmes replied thoughtfully, "though I suspect the truth may be more complex. Note the precision of his movements, the military bearing, the methodical approach. This is no ordinary spy, but a specialist in clandestine surveillance." Holmes directed his lantern toward the floor, examining it carefully. Ah, fortune favours us, Watson. In his haste, or perhaps confidence, our visitor has left behind a small token. He bent down and with tweezers delicately retrieved what appeared to be a cigarette end, placing it in a small envelope. Turkish tobacco, I observed, recognizing the scent I had detected earlier. Indeed, but with a distinctive blend found only in a particular establishment in Vienna. And observe the gold band near the filter. This is a custom-made cigarette for a discerning client. Holmes pocketed the envelope with evident satisfaction. A small clue, but often such details prove most revealing. Holmes completed his examination of the priest hole, taking careful notes of the equipment and its arrangement. We have learned what we came to discover, Watson. Let us depart before our presence is detected by the household. We carefully closed the panel concealing the priest hole, ensuring it was secured exactly as we had found it. With the same caution that had marked our entrance, we made our way through the silent house and out through the servants' door into the garden. The night air felt remarkably fresh after the confined space of the hidden chamber, and I drew a deep breath of relief as we made our way back through the mews. "What now, Holmes?" I asked, as we emerged onto a deserted side street where a solitary gas lamp cast a pool of yellowed light. "Now we must proceed with caution, Watson. Our adversary is clearly a professional of considerable skill and resources. I must verify certain suspicions before we take further action." He glanced at his pocket watch in the lamplight. "It is nearly 2:00. We shall return to Baker Street, where I have several reference works that may shed light on the cipher in the notebook. Tomorrow will bring fresh avenues of inquiry." As we walked toward the main thoroughfare to find a cab, Holmes remained unusually silent, his brow furrowed in concentration. I knew better than to interrupt his thoughts at such moments, but finally, as we settled into a hansom, he spoke again. "There is a pattern emerging, Watson, though its full shape remains elusive. The man we observed tonight is but one piece in a larger design. His connection to the former maid, Agnes Wilson, and to Sebastian Moran must be established. And there is the matter of the neighbouring property. I shall make inquiries about its ownership first thing tomorrow." "You seem troubled, Holmes," I observed. "Not troubled, Watson, challenged. We face an opponent of unusual capability. The precision of this operation, its duration, and its specific targeting of Thornhill's shipping negotiations suggest an enterprise of significant scale and importance." He tapped his fingers thoughtfully against his knee. What we witnessed tonight was not opportunistic espionage, but rather a systematic intelligence operation. As our cab rattled through the deserted streets of nighttime London, I reflected on the evening's discoveries. Someone had been living intermittently within the walls of the Thornhill residence for months, monitoring their most private conversations with technology I had scarcely imagined possible. The implications were deeply disturbing, extending far beyond a simple case of household intrusion. Holmes was right. We had encountered only one visible strand of what was undoubtedly a complex web, and somewhere at the center of that web waited the architect of this elaborate scheme, whose identity and true purpose remained shrouded in mystery. Chapter 7. The Web Unravels. Morning found Holmes already deeply engaged in work when I descended to our sitting room at Baker Street. He sat amid a litter of reference books, telegrams, and notes, the air thick with tobacco smoke from his pipe. The cipher notebook recovered from the priest hole lay open before him, partially transcribed onto a separate sheet in Holmes's precise handwriting. "Ah, Watson," he greeted me without looking up. "I trust you slept well despite our nocturnal adventure?" "Well enough," I replied, pouring myself a cup of the coffee. Mrs. Hudson had left on the sideboard. "I see you've made progress with the cipher." Indeed, it proved less challenging than I initially feared. A simple substitution code, though in German rather than English. The content confirms our suspicions regarding industrial espionage. He pushed a sheet of paper toward me. "Our mysterious occupant of the priest hole has been systematically documenting Thornhill's business negotiations, with particular attention to the Admiralty contracts." I examined the transcription, noting the detailed information about shipping routes, schedules, and cargo specifications. Good heavens, Holmes, this information would be invaluable to a competitor. "Or to foreign interests," Holmes added, lighting a fresh pipe. "But there are curious elements that suggest our case extends beyond mere commercial rivalry." He tapped the notebook. "The writer refers repeatedly to M and Operation Lighthouse. There are also allusions to previous surveillance operations against other shipping companies and government officials." "Indicating a larger conspiracy?" "Precisely, Watson. This appears to be but one strand in an extensive intelligence network." Holmes rose and moved to the window, looking out at the bustling Baker Street below. "I have spent the morning sending telegrams to various contacts. I now await responses that may clarify certain aspects of our investigation." As if summoned by his words, there came a sharp knock at our door. A moment later, a street urchin of perhaps 12 years, one of Holmes's Baker Street irregulars, entered, cap in hand. "Message for you, Mr. Holmes," the boy announced, presenting a folded paper. "From Wiggins. Says it's urgent." Holmes took the paper, reading it quickly before handing the boy a coin. "Excellent work. Tell Wiggins to maintain his position but take no risks." When the boy had departed, Holmes turned to me with evident excitement. "Wiggins has been watching the property adjacent to the Thornhill residence since dawn. He reports that a man matching our intruder's description entered the building at approximately 6 this morning and departed an hour later. More significantly, he was joined briefly by another man whom Wiggins recognized as an employee of Anglo-Oriental Shipping, Moran's company." "Then the connection to Moran is confirmed," I observed. "It would appear so," Holmes replied, "though I suspect Moran himself is but an intermediary in this affair." He consulted his watch. "I must go out shortly to pursue another line of inquiry. In the meantime, I have arranged for Inspector Lestrade to call upon us at 11. Despite his limitations, his official standing may prove useful." Holmes disappeared into his bedroom, emerging some minutes later in the guise of a workman, weathered clothes, a tool bag, and a remarkable transformation of his features through the application of artificial whiskers and staining to his skin. "I shall return before Lestrade arrives," he informed me. "Should any telegrams come, pray preserve them for my examination." With that, he departed, leaving me to ponder the increasingly complex dimensions of our case. I spent the next hour reviewing Holmes's notes and examining various newspaper clippings he had collected regarding Edward Thornhill's shipping business and its competitors. During this time, 3 telegrams arrived in quick succession. True to my promise, I left them sealed for Holmes, who returned promptly at 10:45, once again himself, after discarding his disguise. "A most productive morning, Watson," he announced, reaching eagerly for the telegrams. "I visited the property adjacent to the Thornhills under the pretense of being an electrical repairman. The building is indeed undergoing extensive renovation, ostensibly to convert it into luxury apartments. However, the construction crew is remarkably small for such an undertaking, and access to certain areas is peculiarly restricted." He tore open the first telegram, his expression growing increasingly satisfied as he read each in turn. "Most illuminating," he murmured. "The property is owned by a company called Beacon Holdings, incorporated just 6 months ago. The principal investor appears to be a Swiss banking concern, which my sources inform me has connections to none other than Sebastian Moran. "The web begins to take shape," I remarked. "Indeed, though I suspect we have yet to identify the true spider at its centre." Holmes consulted the final telegram. "As I anticipated, our mysterious night visitor is almost certainly Colonel Heinrich Strauss, formerly of the Austrian Military Intelligence Service, now operating as a private contractor in industrial espionage. His specialty is precisely the sort of long-term surveillance operation we have uncovered." Before Holmes could elaborate further, we heard Mrs. Hudson's step on the stair, followed by the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, the lean, ferret-faced detective from Scotland Yard, who had figured in so many of our previous cases. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Lestrade greeted us with a nod. "Your message suggested a matter of some urgency." "Indeed, Inspector," Holmes replied, clearing a space among his papers. "Pray be seated. We have uncovered what appears to be an extensive espionage operation centred on the shipping negotiations between Edward Thornhill and the Admiralty." Holmes proceeded to outline our investigation thus far, though I noted he carefully omitted certain details, particularly regarding our nocturnal exploration of the priest hole. Lestrade listened with growing consternation. "This is most disturbing, Mr. Holmes," he said, when the account was complete. "Industrial espionage is one thing, but if Admiralty contracts are being compromised, it becomes a matter of national security." "Precisely why I have involved you, Inspector," Holmes replied. "This case requires official sanction for its resolution. I propose to lay a trap that will catch our spy in the act, providing irrefutable evidence of the operation and, hopefully, revealing the full extent of the conspiracy." "What do you require from me?" Lestrade asked, professional interest evidently piqued. "Your official presence tomorrow evening, along with 2 or 3 of your most discreet and capable officers. I shall arrange with Mr. Thornhill to create a scenario that will draw our quarry into the open." Holmes's eyes gleamed with anticipation. "The Thornhills will appear to depart for an evening engagement, leaving the house seemingly empty. Meanwhile, Thornhill will return through the servants' entrance to his study, where he will conduct a discussion about a fictional but highly sensitive shipment of naval materials." "And you expect this Colonel Strauss to be monitoring from the priest hole?" I asked. "Undoubtedly. The bait will be irresistible, information of apparent critical importance, delivered when the house is believed to be vacant." Holmes turned back to Lestrade. "We shall position ourselves to intercept him either within the house or as he attempts to exit through the neighbouring property." Lestrade considered the plan, then nodded his agreement. "Very well, Mr. Holmes, I'll have my men ready, but I must insist that we proceed strictly within the bounds of the law." "Of course, Inspector," Holmes replied with a thin smile. "We seek only to apprehend a trespasser caught in the act of illegal surveillance. The evidence gathered subsequently will determine the broader charges." After Lestrade's departure, Holmes spent the afternoon refining his strategy, dispatching further telegrams and receiving occasional reports from his network of irregulars who continued to monitor both the Thornhill residence and the neighbouring property. "It appears our Colonel Strauss has not returned to the priest hole today," Holmes observed as evening approached. "This is consistent with his pattern of occasional rather than continuous occupation. He likely reviews the recorded information elsewhere, returning only to change the cylinders and gather fresh intelligence." "A most patient predator," I commented. "Indeed, Watson, and like many predators, his patience may prove his undoing." Holmes tapped his fingers thoughtfully against the arm of his chair. "Tomorrow evening should prove most illuminating. We face a formidable opponent, methodical, experienced, and well-resourced. But even the most careful adversary eventually makes an error, particularly when presented with an opportunity too tempting to ignore. As darkness fell over Baker Street, I could not help but feel a growing sense of anticipation. The case that had begun with mere household disturbances had revealed itself to be something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated operation with implications extending into matters of national security. Tomorrow would bring the culmination of our investigation, and with it, I hoped, the resolution of the enigma of the empty house. Chapter 8. The Man in the Empty House. The evening of our planned operation arrived with a fine, persistent drizzle that shrouded London in a glistening veil. Holmes and I had spent the day making final preparations, reviewing the plan with Mr. Thornhill, and coordinating with Inspector Lestrade. By 6 o'clock we were assembled in the kitchen of the Thornhill residence, Holmes, myself, Lestrade, and 2 plainclothes officers whom the inspector had introduced as Constables Parker and Murray. "The household staff have been given the evening off," Thornhill informed us in hushed tones. "My wife and daughter have genuinely gone to the theatre with friends and will not return until well after midnight. As far as any observer would be concerned, the house stands empty save for the Winters, who are confined to their quarters as arranged." "Excellent," Holmes replied, consulting his pocket watch. "It is imperative that our movements remain undetected. Inspector, your men should take their positions now, one at the rear garden exit and one covering the adjoining property." Lestrade nodded, and the constables departed silently to their assigned posts. The kitchen, lit only by a single shaded lamp, cast long shadows across the concerned faces of our small company. "Mr. Thornhill," Holmes continued, "you understand your role precisely. You are to enter your study at exactly 7:30, seat yourself at your desk and appear to review documents while speaking the text we prepared, loudly enough to be heard through the wall, but not so unnaturally as to arouse suspicion." "I understand completely, Mr. Holmes," Thornhill replied with determination. "Meanwhile, Lestrade, Watson, and I will conceal ourselves in the adjoining drawing-room, ready to act when our quarry makes his appearance." Holmes's keen eyes gleamed in the lamplight. "The true skill lies in timing. We must allow Colonel Strauss to fully commit himself to the act of espionage before we move." At precisely 7 o'clock, as planned, the Winters made a deliberate show of extinguishing most of the house lights, creating the appearance that the residence had been secured for the night. 20 minutes later, Thornhill made his way silently through the darkened house to his study, while Holmes, Lestrade, and I took our positions in the drawing-room, which offered a clear line of sight to the study door across the hall. The minutes passed with excruciating slowness. Holmes sat motionless in the darkness, his entire being focused on the slightest sound or movement. Lestrade, though less accustomed to such patient surveillance, maintained a commendable stillness. I found my hand straying occasionally to the revolver in my pocket, its solid weight providing some reassurance in the tense atmosphere. At 7:30 precisely, we heard Thornhill begin his performance, the rustle of papers followed by his voice, measured and clear, discussing a fictional shipment of naval communication equipment scheduled for transport to Malta aboard his vessel, the Persephone. "The Admiralty insists on absolute secrecy," we heard him say, apparently dictating notes to himself. "The new cipher systems must reach Admiral Harrington's fleet by the 15th, before the Russian vessels complete their deployment in the eastern Mediterranean. Our adjusted route will bypass the usual ports of call." He continued in this vein, providing convincing details that would surely entice any eavesdropper seeking naval intelligence. Holmes had crafted the script masterfully, making it appear both authentic and valuable. For nearly 20 minutes, nothing occurred. Then, so faintly that I might have imagined it, came a sound from within the walls, the barest whisper of movement. Holmes's hand closed on my wrist, confirming that he too had detected it. Another 10 minutes passed, Thornhill continuing his monologue with remarkable stamina. Then came the sound we had been waiting for, a soft click from the panelling in the study. Through the partially open drawing-room door, we could just discern movement in the dimly lit study, a section of the wall opening, and a figure emerging cautiously from the priest hole. Holmes signalled for us to wait, his grip on my arm tightening fractionally. The intruder, whom I could now recognize as matching the silhouette we had observed previously, moved stealthily toward Thornhill's desk. There was a brief moment when Thornhill faltered in his recitation, startled despite his preparation by the actual appearance of the spy. To his credit, he recovered almost instantly and continued speaking. The intruder produced what appeared to be a small camera and began photographing the documents spread across the desk. It was at this moment that Holmes gave the signal, and we burst from our concealment. Lestrade was first through the door, revolver drawn. "Scotland Yard, do not move!" he commanded. What followed occurred with such rapidity that I can scarcely provide a coherent sequence. The intruder, displaying remarkable reflexes, overturned the desk lamp, plunging the room into darkness. There was a shout from Thornhill, the sound of a body colliding with furniture, and a shot, fired by Lestrade, as I later learned, that splintered the woodwork near the window. Holmes had anticipated this reaction, however, and had positioned himself to intercept the man's most likely escape route, not back to the priest hole, but toward the study door. There was a brief, violent struggle in the darkness, during which I managed to relight the lamp, revealing Holmes grappling with a compact, powerfully built man with close-cropped greying hair and a military bearing. "I would advise against further resistance, Colonel Strauss," Holmes said, through gritted teeth as Lestrade and I moved to assist. "Your operation has been thoroughly compromised." The man ceased his struggles, his face settling into a mask of cold resignation as Lestrade secured his wrists with handcuffs. Now, fully illuminated, I could observe him more carefully, a man of perhaps 50 years, with the weathered complexion of one who had served in tropical climates and the disciplined physique of a career soldier. His eyes, pale blue and unnervingly steady, surveyed us with calculating intelligence. "You have me at a disadvantage, sir," he replied in accented but fluent English. "Sherlock Holmes," my friend supplied, "though I suspect the name is not unknown to you." A flicker of recognition crossed the man's features. "Indeed? Your reputation extends to certain professional circles on the continent, as does yours, Colonel Heinrich Strauss, formerly of Austrian military intelligence, more recently an independent contractor for various interests." Holmes straightened his clothing, dishevelled from the struggle. "A distinguished career until now." Thornhill, who had remained behind his desk during the confrontation, now approached, his face flushed with anger. "This is the man who has been hiding in my house, spying on my family?" "The very same," Holmes confirmed, "and I believe a search of both the priest hole and the neighbouring property will yield substantial evidence of his extended surveillance operation." Lestrade dispatched one of his constables to summon additional officers, while the other maintained guard over our prisoner. Within half an hour, the Thornhill residence had become the centre of considerable police activity, though conducted with remarkable discretion given the sensitive nature of the case. The search proved even more revealing than Holmes had anticipated. In a room of the adjacent property, we discovered an extensive operation centre, maps of shipping routes, transcriptions of numerous recorded conversations, photographic equipment, and most significantly, documentation linking the entire enterprise to Sebastian Moran's Anglo-Oriental Shipping Company and beyond, to a consortium of international interests. Under questioning, Strauss maintained a professional detachment, neither denying his actions nor volunteering information beyond confirming his identity. It was only when Holmes produced the notebook with its references to Operation Lighthouse that a hint of surprise crossed his features. "You have been most thorough, Mr. Holmes," he remarked, "though I suspect certain aspects of this affair will remain beyond even your remarkable reach." "Perhaps," Holmes acknowledged, "though the principal objectives have been achieved, your operation is dismantled, Mr. Thornhill's security restored, and the Admiralty contracts protected from compromise. Later that evening, as we sat in Thornhill's drawing room with Lestrade, Holmes explained to our still-shaken client how he had unravelled the mystery. The repositioning of furniture, the subtle disturbances in dust patterns, these were not random occurrences but the inevitable consequences of someone moving regularly within your house, observing specific locations where valuable conversations might be overheard. Holmes accepted a brandy from Thornhill with a nod of thanks. The listening device was sophisticated, but it was the human element, Colonel Strauss's occasional presence within your walls, that created the subtle atmospheric changes you and Mrs. Thornhill detected upon your return. "But why my family?" Thornhill asked. "There are surely other shipping companies involved in government contracts." "Yours possessed a unique combination of attributes," Holmes explained. "A historic house with existing hidden chambers, a neighbouring property available for purchase and modification, and most importantly, a pivotal position in the new Admiralty negotiations. Moran's consortium stood to gain millions by securing advanced knowledge of your shipping schedules and security arrangements." As we departed that night, with Strauss in custody and the evidence secured, I remarked to Holmes on the extraordinary nature of the case. To think that a man could live within the walls of a house, emerging only when its occupants were absent, it borders on the fantastical, Holmes. "Yet it illustrates a principle I have often observed, Watson," he replied, his face thoughtful in the gaslight. "The most effective deceptions are those that exploit our assumptions about the fundamental nature of our surroundings. The Thornhills assumed their home was secure and private when occupied solely by their family. Colonel Strauss exploited that assumption with remarkable patience and precision." He glanced back at the house as our cab pulled away. In that sense, the house was never truly empty, a sobering thought for any household. For the Thornhill family, the enigma of the empty house had been solved, though I suspected the sense of violation would linger long after our investigation concluded. As for Sebastian Moran and his international connections, they would prove to be threads in a larger web, one that Holmes would continue to unravel in the months to come, leading us into adventures that must for now remain unchronicled. I hope you enjoyed our journey through the enigma of the empty house. If you did, please consider becoming a member of our Café Stories community. Your support helps keep these tales of mystery and adventure coming. Until next time, stay curious, keep your powers of observation sharp, and remember, there is nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact. This is Alfie, signing off from Café Stories.